You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and we're glad you tuned in. I'd like to remind you of the value of leaving reviews on places like iTunes or wherever you're listening, as well as the value of sharing us with your various networks. It's a real pleasure for me to host most of the TeachThought podcast episodes and get to bring you thoughtful and interesting guests. And as our audience grows, so does the quality and the quantity of guests that are available to us. So we do encourage you and would appreciate any of those reviews, shares, and things like that to help us grow our audience. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to me via email at drew@teachthought.com. If you have stumbled upon us but are not familiar with our work in other areas, just a few notes that we do directly work with schools, leaders, and teachers to help them grow to better prepare learners for what we call the modern world by building upon the ethos of TeachThought.com. So I invite you to visit our professional development website, wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find information on the variety of workshops, consulting services, and events that we offer to help you grow in areas like project-based learning and inquiry, differentiated instruction, assessment, literacy, growth mindset, leadership, and much more. So I invite you again to contact us today to explore how we can help design and deliver professional learning that provokes profound thinking driven by your beautiful questions. In today's podcast, I spoke with Michelle Mattoon, who is the director of the National School Reform Faculty, an organization that I'm a big fan of, and we use one of their protocols pretty exclusively in our project-based learning workshops and some other protocols that they have in other parts of our work. But we talked about the tools that they have developed and how to best use those in developing what they call professional learning communities and how those differ from some other versions or definitions of PLCs, and really thinking about how we give and get feedback and create a culture of doing that, as well as the idea of growth mindset and the belonging mindset, of which she's going to be talking about on an upcoming TEDx talk. So again, I don't know exactly why it has taken so long to have Michelle and the NSRF on our podcast, because we are big fans of their work. And hopefully this conversation is as enjoyable for you and helpful as it was for me. Welcome, Michelle. Happy to have you here on the podcast. For those of you who are joining us, Michelle Mattoon, who is the director of the National School Reform Faculty, just up the road from us, not too far, in Bloomington, Indiana. We're based out of Louisville, Kentucky. So big fan of the work, and we use it quite a bit in our project-based learning workshops, as well as some of the other protocols, but we use the modified tuning protocol extensively because I think it's a great way to get professional dialogue going and establish some of the culture pieces. But Michelle, I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, because you can probably do it much better than I, as well as give our listeners a little bit of background on how you became director and your path to getting there.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Michelle Mattoon, and it's funny, I was listening to a previous podcast that you did with a gentleman who's superintendent, and he remembered saying, I felt like I was never going to be a teacher. Mm-hmm. And I had that same feeling, maybe most of us do, but I wound up being a teacher in first and second grade. I taught at a little independent school, Harmony School here in Bloomington, Indiana, and I taught there for over 2 decades. What I liked about that school was that because we were independent, we really weren't tied to the high stakes testing We evaluated and assessed our kids a certain way. We had very small class sizes, and we really had a lot of freedom to teach the way we felt the kids needed to learn the best way they could. So it was an amazing experience. So I worked there for over 2 decades, and then I also was the elementary coordinator for 3 years. But at that point, I felt like I wanted to really get out and do more with all the things that I had learned during that time. It was interesting. While I was a teacher, I took a training around 1994, 1995, and it was called the Critical Friends Group Training. And it was developed by the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. They had decided that they wanted to build a professional development training that instead of having an expert come in and bring one of those big binders, we call them the big binder people with all that stuff, and they would plop it down in front of you and they'd sort of talk at you for a couple of days. And then you take that big binder and you put it in the back of your classroom and it would gather dust and you would never really look at it again. So instead of that, they thought, why aren't we using the brain power of the people who are actually in our schools that work with us every day? We're so isolated and siloed in what we do, and we really could learn from each other. So they brought in teachers from all across the United States into kind of like a think tank and had them come up with these things they called protocols, which were actually structured ways for educators to be able to talk to each other and delve deeply into their work and really help each other produce best practices and increase student achievement. So our school was one of the very first schools that actually received that training. We were one of the pilot programs. And so when I took the training, it was like an epiphany for me. Really, light bulbs went off all over the place. And I felt like this was it. I mean, this was something I could not only use in my classroom, but I really changed the way that my colleagues and I talked to each other and learned from each other. And it was just an amazing experience. So I became a coach of one of these critical friends groups. So they're a kind of PLC. And we use these different protocols to really talk about our work. So then I thought, wow, this is so great. I'd actually like to conduct this training with other people and go to other schools and do this. So I went through the facilitation program and I became a national facilitator for the National School Reform faculty. And around 2008, when the economy crashed, was about the same time I was thinking about getting out of the classroom and administration. And I was actually asked by the executive director of Harmony Education Center, which NSRF is a part of, whether I would be an interim director. And the idea was we would move our organization, we're a nonprofit, but we would move it from being funded by big funders, which we lost in 2008, to actually, sustaining ourselves just by doing the trainings and the membership. And so I took that on, and I've been the director ever since.
Well, very interesting. I'd often wondered, because the website for the folks who are not familiar is NSRF, which of course stands for National School Reform Faculty, but it's nsrfharmony.org.
Right.
And I've often thought, why would they have Harmony in there? Because it doesn't certainly make it easier to remember, but there had to have been some reason. So are you still connected with the Harmony School?
Yeah, actually, I'm sitting in Harmony School right now. My offices are in the basement. So Harmony School is also under Harmony Education Center. So we have Harmony School. We have the National School Reform Faculty. We have an all ages club called Rhinos that serves the community in Bloomington. And we are also have partnership with Indiana University. And so we work with them too, with the Myers Harmony Institute there. So.
Okay. And so there is a faculty that is the National School Reform Faculty, and you do workshops, I know, in Bloomington. You have one coming up in October, is that right? And then you also do some in other, like on-site, similar to how we do as well.
Yeah, we actually do most of our work on site. And we do have facilitators, about 30 facilitators across the country and around the world. So we do have international facilitators as well. Mm-hmm. And and any of those facilitators can do what we call an open training, which is to have a training in their area where people come to them. Mm-hmm. But most of our work is going on site and doing trainings for folks.
Okay. Well, I became more familiar with your work through my time as a national faculty member with the Buck Institute and their use of what they call Critical Friends Protocol. We use a very similar process here at TeachThought PD. We call it the Modified Tuning Protocol because there is some differences between the Critical Friends groups and the protocol. And I don't know if you want to get into sort of the differences and what that means to you all. But I think it's just such a really powerful protocol for that professional dialogue. And are you aware, how did that particular protocol develop, and what was the genesis of that? And maybe how it's different from Critical Friends groups?
Yeah. So that particular protocol really does have an interesting story. And I would just like to say for people who don't really know what we do, we actually are a kind of a PLC, a particular kind of PLC. So we're different from the DeFore. I know you interviewed mm-hmm. him a while ago. And PLCs, I think people think about DeFore when they think about PLCs, and they do a lot of work with data. And, what can we do to help our kids, what kind of interventions, how we can get them to pass these tests, and those kinds of things. But with Critical Friends Group, we do have data protocols, which actually we're often called when people start PLCs. They're like, okay, we have this time and we're supposed to look at data, but we really don't know how to. Mm-hmm. So we have structures that help them do that. But we have protocols to help you tune a work, to look at data, to do strategic planning, to solve professional problems and dilemmas that you might have, to brainstorm, to be innovative. So we have close to 200 different kinds of protocols and activities on our website, and they are all tools that educators can use in PLC time to really talk to each other deeply about their work and to get work done. I mean, they're very efficient and useful. So the tuning protocol, there's probably about 3 protocols that we have that get used most, I would say worldwide. Tuning is one of the top 3. And the reason why is you can take anything, as long as it's a concrete thing, and you can make it better using the tuning protocol. It was originally designed by a classroom teacher, and he did a lot of project-based learning in his classroom, mm-hmm. and he designed it for kids to tune each other's work. So when you do project-based learning, you're actually using it with the original purpose that he had designed to have kids, help each other before the final project, tune their projects.
Very fascinating. And one of the things that I think is really valuable there is really making sure, and we try to talk about this whenever we do any of these sort of protocols. At least in my estimation, and of course you're more of an expert at this, but that there's real clarity around the lens through which you're doing the evaluation. Because when we talk about giving, warm or cool feedback, or I likes or I wonders, or whatever that terminology is, we want to be specific in our feedback. So it's really, I've found difficult to give specific feedback when we don't know and don't have a common understanding of what what it's supposed to look like. What are our standards? I like the word ideals because we're constantly in pursuit of them, but regardless, what is it that we're after? Because then you can't be specific if you don't have that lens. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. And during our general training for how to use these protocols is usually a 5-day training. And we spend a lot of time, number one, we spend a lot of time talking about how do you give warm and cool feedback skillfully. There's definitely right ways and wrong ways. And the right ways all have to do with giving feedback that actually helps that person achieve what they want, without pushing them into a place of being defensive and feeling like they have to, defend themselves. So that's really important. And I often ask people in the room, how many people here have actually taken a formal class to teach you how to give feedback specifically? And we work with groups of 15. And do you want to guess how many people actually raise their hand when I ask that question?
Out of 15, 2?
Yeah, maybe.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy. And that's true with on the teacher level and also on the admin leadership level. But yet that's what we're supposed to do. So anyway, we spend a lot of time really training people around that piece. And then also the other piece that you mentioned. So how do we know exactly what we should be giving feedback on? I mean, here's this lesson plan, right? So we really talk a lot about how to pre-conference. If you're the person who's running that protocol, you need to meet with that person ahead of time. You need to do 2 things when you meet with 3 things when you meet with that person. Number 1, you have to really know what they have. Number 2, you have to know what they want to get out of it. And what we say, well, after you have that conversation where you really think you've pinpointed exactly what they need help with, so they can match that to a certain standard, or they can match that to, okay, I did this lesson with my kids last year, and they really didn't give me what I wanted, and I suspect it's because the instructions are not clear and concise. And so I really need help around that piece, right? So you help them pinpoint what they want, and then you create a focusing question, and that question helps focus the feedback so that everybody who gives those suggestions, it has to only be around that question. So an example of a focus question might be, so how can I change this instruction part so that my students come up, hand in the work, the product that I expect them to hand in, right? And so they will talk more about what that means during their presentation part. But now that you're only giving feedback around that specifically, the instructions, right? You're not giving feedback around any other part. And that actually makes it so that people can really hear the feedback, because it's feedback that they've asked for and they need and they can use as soon as that protocol is over.
Does it have to be a question, or could it be a statement? For example, one of the things that I like to do and have found some value in just the real qualitative language and the unpacking that it would take, and maybe it doesn't work well in a protocol like this, but for example, when we talk about project-based learning, that we might use a statement to guide the thinking around the design and planning, or the assessment and then the implementation. So a statement like the project includes quality PBL design elements to help the teacher pull rather than push learning authentically through a project. So we've got lots of qualitative language there that you've got to unpack, or is that too dense in a protocol like that? And
I think it's a little too dense. I think it's a little too general, and I think it leads. I mean, I know that you would take people through a process that would unpack each piece of that. But what we have found that if you can isolate, one thing and really have people concentrate on one part of that sentence and say, okay, so this is what we want to do, and just turn it into a question.
Right.
So how do I do that? Right? And so they're basically answering that question for you, giving suggestions that will specifically. So you can take statements like that and just kind of turn it into a question. How can I do this? What can I add to my work so that this will happen, right? Yeah.
And we actually use those statements. We wouldn't use those statements in a protocol like that because of that denseness. I was curious on your thinking, but what we like to do is then use that to generate questions that might be a little bit more specific. So
sure.
How do I pull rather than push? What does that mean? And really unpacking it. So then you could certainly use that in a protocol. Do you find, or have you found any remedy, or maybe you haven't found this? One of the things that we know and experience in, let's say, a 3-day project-based learning workshop is that we want to increase the level of peer critique as we go from sort of day 1 to day 2 to day 3. Part of it, the sophistication of that critique increases, partially because the idea itself, the project itself is developing, but also the understanding of quality project-based learning pieces and characteristics. But even then, by the third day of a teacher, with a teacher or teachers who are fairly new to this project-based learning shift, the quality of the feedback sometimes is perhaps lacking because they haven't even tried to implement yet, so they don't have that context from which to draw. And of course that gets better and gets better and gets better, but are there any remedies for that, or have you found that as a problem sort of getting started?
So our training is 5 days, and the first day of the training is really about building safety and trust in the group. And you and I talked a little earlier before this podcast began about how important I think belonging mindset is to this work. Right. And I actually think that any group, if you feel like you belong to a group and you trust the people around you and you feel a level of safety, that you're not putting your imperfect work out there so that people can evaluate it and grade it and give you a big fat F, on your forehead. If you put that work out because you say, I would need the help of my colleagues to help this be better, and I'm willing to help you with your imperfect work to help you do that. And so it's an idea of growth mindset, right? We're constantly improving. We realize that we're never perfect. But that first day is crucial, I think, to that process, because we get to know each other. We set agreements for how we're going to work. We talk about the different kinds of work styles we have. We get more deep and personal as the day goes out. And then that second day, the rubber hits the road and people start bringing stuff in. And actually, one of the first things we have them bring, we show them the tuning protocol. So they're actually bringing in a piece of their work. By the time they actually bring the tuning protocol, they know the people, they've developed a certain level of trust, they have agreements, and they know how to give and receive feedback, because we just went through a big thing about how they do that. And so actually, even it takes 2 days, but by that second day, they give some really good feedback. They're ready to go. But as you noticed, I mean, we couldn't do that first day. They would not be able to do it for various reasons.
And then does that, as they go forward, and again, I'm wondering how that might shift too with work that is like project-based learning, as I mentioned, is a bit of a shift for lots of teachers versus something that might be a bit more generic in the idea of improving craft of teaching and learning, and focusing especially on something that was assessment oriented or something like that, data, those kinds of things. So that shift seems like it takes a little longer. It for us in our workshops, one of the things we want to do is give them an opportunity to give and get feedback. But really, almost more importantly, because our facilitators are there as coaches to give the highest quality feedback that we can give. And we certainly value the feedback that peers are giving, but really sort of establishing and modeling some of those norms, because without fail, almost across the board, it seems like when we do a protocol like the modified tuning protocol that we borrow from you, that the feeling in the room is often elation afterwards. Because I have found, and I often say this, that teachers want to have professional dialogue. They're passionate about their work almost across the board. They say to administrators, we want more time to talk and discuss and have dialogue. Of course, administrators often say, well, when we give you more time, then you don't use it particularly productively. And there's some truth to that as well in lots of schools. So these protocols are a great way to establish some of those norms. And I find when they're done well and done right, and that does take some time and some work, and the teachers are the worst at following the rules, which is certainly funny.
It is.
Yeah, and then unpacking and debriefing and processing why it is so hard and why those rules are there, but of who's supposed to listen, who's supposed to talk, how much time you have, why there's dead time, and all of that. But they're elated. They're so happy to have had some dialogue around their work, and it's not about them; it's about the work. So it isn't personal. It doesn't feel like you have to defend.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a key.
Yeah. So getting some of those things encultured in schools across the country, around the world, I think would be just a tremendous piece. And I sometimes even say, we talk about teacher evaluations, and you've mentioned the binders before. Most teachers who are worth their salt just sort of view the typical teacher evaluations as almost laughable. It's like just this sort of thing that happens, and you're on cycle, you're off cycle, and there's obviously there's varying degrees of that in schools, some of it better than others. But I find I would think that the trust that and the passion that we have towards pulling in the same direction, using protocols, and having the mindset of this is what we're all trying to pull towards this is what we're trying to produce and create, and let's give and get feedback and hold each other accountable. I think that that's a much more powerful and empowering model of teacher evaluation than sort of the administrator teacher hierarchical approach. And I don't know if have you been able to, or have you seen any of your protocols in your work used in teacher evaluation scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, so our protocols were made for teachers to help each other. And so we're really careful because we don't want administrators to sort of use these as weapons, right. As teachers might see them as evaluation. Mm-hmm. But what we have done is, I think what the protocols do, and the critical friends groups, that piece about you saying maybe they're not using their time the best way they could sometimes when they're meeting. Mm-hmm. We often have people, as I said earlier, who take the PLC training, and they have the time to meet, and they just sort of sit around because they don't know how to really help each other.
Right.
They don't know how to do it. And of course they don't. So what we do is we give them the tools to do that. And I think that unless people see that profound change that you talked about, with people at the end of an experience saying, thank you, this was great. Thank you for all your help, as opposed to, oh my gosh, now I feel all like somebody just marked me up with a red pen and I'll never open up my mouth again because I feel so defensive. It really turns the culture. It really does. And I think that's connected to evaluation, because if leadership understands what teachers are doing and they have goals that they're working on and meeting, and there's evidence to suggest that they are meeting them, it sure does make evaluation a whole lot easier. And maybe it's less of an evaluation and more of a coaching or a mentoring or a talking back and forth about, so how are you doing with these goals? And, so I think it can have a profound effect on the evaluation. And having said that, we've also had some independent schools call us and actually have us come in as consultants for how we can help them with their evaluation process to make it align more with what their teachers are doing to help each other.
Well, yeah, so the idea that we would use these protocols in a way to get some culture, but like you mentioned, there's not the processes. Many teachers don't know about that, and it's a great tool to get you more impact and power out of those PLCs. When you say PLCs, you sort of differentiate between the PLCs that might be defined by Solution Tree and DeFore,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
And
which, interestingly enough, Solution Tree is also in Bloomington, Indiana.
Interesting.
Their headquarters are here as well. Yeah, it is interesting. I think that's, I think DeFore stuff out there with the PLCs is much more well known than we are. But, given that, I mean, PLC is professional learning community,
right.
And critical friends groups are a particular kind of PLC. I mean, we're trademarked. We're as is our critical friends groups and the stuff that we do. So we are a particular kind of PLC for sure.
And how would you differentiate?
I think that PLCs, oftentimes, the way most people think the training is a lot about looking at data to decide what kind of interventions or supports you can get kids. I think a lot of failing schools use PLC time to really solely focus on the bubble kids, those kids who are really close to passing the standardized tests but haven't quite. And so how can we get together and really get them the stuff that they need to pass those high stakes tests? I'm sure that that's, not the vision of what PLCs are, not the only vision of what PLCs are. But I think it is, depending on your situation, how you might interpret what you're supposed to be doing during a PLC. But whereas we do focus on data because we definitely have protocols about looking at data, and then what to do. If we look at the data, here are the patterns we see, here's what we think is going on, and here are the steps that we think we need to take, taking us through that process step by step. That's clearly, very helpful in those situations. But we just offer a whole wide range of things. So teaching isn't all just about data and getting kids to pass tests. I mean, we know that as educators, there's so much more that we do. That's not what a full education is, right?
That's blasphemy.
I know. I'm sorry. And I think that's what critical friends groups were designed to do, to have teachers help each other with that full education service that we're supposed to do for our children. Not just get them, only look at those numbers and we only test certain things, right? And evaluate certain things. But there's so much more to education than those things that we're doing that with.
Right. Is there anything? One of the things that I sometimes wonder about, and I think I'm guessing you have experienced this at some, or not experienced it, but perhaps dealt with it in some way, shape, or form. The sort of fatigue of doing protocols. I think we certainly have lots of work to do to have more protocols and and that professional dialogue, the quality of professional dialogue and tools to improve that increased in our schools. But there is a limit or a time when these protocols are maybe not what we want to do, or how do you find that balance?
Yeah, I would say absolutely, without a doubt, not even an argument. So what we say is this. What do you want to get out of it? If you have a particular thing that you need done and you think a protocol can help you do that, then you use that protocol. But what we don't want is people to take the 5-day training and be super excited about these protocols, and then they want to turn protocols into a verb and just protocol everything.
Right.
Because protocoling everything, we actually do call it creates protocol fatigue, which is evidenced by an epidemic of eye rolling anytime somebody mentions the word protocol. So you want to use the tools well. And I always use the analogy of, when people take any kind of training, I'm sure you've heard this 100 times too, people will groan and moan. It's like, oh, it's another thing on my plate. I have all these things, and this is just another thing. And so what we say to people is okay, imagine your plate, and there's all the stuff you have to do on your plate. The protocols are not one more thing on your plate. They're the tools that you use to get those things off your plate in the most efficient and effective manner. Now, you may have to spend some time to learn how to use a fork or some chopsticks or a spoon, but once you know how to use them, it's easy, right? You just use it. It's just a tool. Nobody goes to dinner and picks up the fork and goes, ooh, look at this fork. This fork is so great. It's a wonderful fork. No, you don't look at the fork. You use it to get your work done. And you want to pick the right one. If you need a fork, that's not going to help if you got a bowl of soup. So you have to learn that piece. But they really are just tools, and you don't want to use a hammer if you need a saw, or you don't need anything at all, right? Why would you use it? So I think people have to really be careful when they use them.
Yeah, there is a real, I don't know if it's nerdiness is not the right word, but that fatigue that it's like, oh man, here we go with another one of these things, and I just want to sit and talk. I just want to have more informal conversation, and this person is just forcing me into these roles and these time slots and these rules and things like that. There's a real fine balance there that I'm sure you're keenly aware of and have to navigate.
Yeah, I think if I could just say one more thing about that. I think that it's important for people to realize, because when they first start taking the training, and I have them, actually go through the first protocol process, and I debrief with them. And I say, so what did you think? And people might say, oh, this was great, and da-da-da. But there'll always be somebody who says, well, it kind of felt unnatural. And my response to that is always good. Because what that means is you are communicating in a way that's different than the way you usually communicate. And that's important, because the definition of being insane is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And these protocols are made to have us communicate in a different way so that we can actually leave the room feeling like we have real actionable next steps. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think you just have to be careful. Like, I don't want to follow the rules. They feel too confining. But the point is that without those rules, you're just going to talk to each other on a very surface level, and you may never get down deep into it. So you just have to figure it out. Do I need a protocol? And if I do, here's why it's really important for us to use it in this way, and really hit on the whys. And we do this a lot in the training, especially that last day, talking about the importance of, getting buy-in, but giving the whys and just telling people why it's important so they are more open to using them.
Yeah, my experience, kind of circling back to this sort of fatigue issue, and it is, I think, really a piece of culture that we want to instill and grow that then allows not even when you're not in a protocol that you're sort of really engaging in because you've practiced and become just this is part of how we discuss and professionally talk about the work at a different level than some of those surface things. But, there is, I remember years ago, and I tell this story sort of as an anecdotal joke about how the importance of doing these protocols and doing this kind of work well versus the danger and the problems that arise when you do it poorly.
Yes.
And when I did it as a teacher many years ago, I did a protocol. I don't know if it was based on your work. It was so long ago, and I didn't make any connections at that point. But I remember somebody sitting in a room with some sort of administrator, and they had us together in sort of a circle, and there was some piece of work, and we were supposed to be evaluating it. All of those things ostensibly good. And then it came to me and they said something like, you have 2 minutes to say good things about this work. And again, there was no lens, there was no rubric, there was nothing from which I could pull. And I jokingly say, it's sort of like the Dumb and Dumber thing. I like it a lot, like
of course. What else are you going to say?
Yeah. I don't know how I'm supposed to judge this. I mean, I could certainly make some guesses, but we're not all on the same page on that. And I walked away thinking, well, that was the dumbest thing I've ever done. And I was so frustrated. And it took some I don't know, convincing to get me into, well, it actually took me being in a space where people were engaging in professional dialogue, and there was some safety in that cultural norm, the norms of the room, that, and I know we're going to talk about belonging mindset, and I think that leads us into that, but that idea that if you do it poorly, it can really, just like anything, project-based learning, if you do it poorly, not only is it not going to be effective, but it's often one of those things with teachers, they say, well, I've tried that, and that was a train wreck. I'll never do that again. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's really hard. And we often ask, people ask us, can you do this training in less than 5 days? And we always say no. I'd like it to be 6 or 7 if you want me, but we've made it 5. But we need each of those days because we need to really show people, because the idea is once they take our training, they become official Critical Friends Group coaches, and they can go back to their school and they can lead their Critical Friends groups, their PLCs, using these protocols. So it's a lot. I mean, they have to learn them. They need to learn the whys behind them, and they need to learn how to facilitate them, which is a whole nother skill. And if you do it badly, people will reject it and they will never want to do it again.
Right.
It's just so difficult. And, and I do want to say, so in another life that I have, I also have my own consulting company where I do similar work with businesses and other organizations. And people ask me to come in and facilitate a day for them. Like they may have some problems that are happening. Lately, I've been working in a medical device company, and they may have something that they want, some issue that they want to work through. And so they bring everybody in for a day, and they give me this thing that says, okay, Michelle, you need to, by the end of the day, we want to get this done. And I say, okay. And then I just facilitate a day. And how I do it is I use these protocols, but I don't teach them. I don't overtly say, oh, we're doing this protocol for this. I just say, okay, the first thing we're going to do is so-and-so is going to present the problem. And then we're going to have X amount of time to ask that person some questions, right? I just take them through it. And they love the structure, and they often come back and say, wow, that was so great. But I didn't front load it by saying, okay, this is a protocol and everybody has to act this way. And, I just do it. And for some reason, that helps people become much more open-minded to the process. And it feels more natural to them for some reason if you're just like taking it one step at a time, which I think is an interesting human being thing. But yeah, so we talk a lot about this kind of thing when we actually do the training.
Right. So let's talk a bit about mindset. And I know before we went live, we were talking about belonging mindset, and you have an upcoming TEDx talk. But to lead us into that growth mindset, which is in that same realm, there's been some pushback from folks on growth mindset as the value of it and the importance of it. Some research that shows that it's not particularly effective. I tend to feel like it's misunderstood and misapplied, which certainly happens way too often in education. But what's your thinking on growth mindset and the positives and negatives of that?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it is misunderstood. I think that, Carol Dweck certainly has had many rebuttal articles, if you would,
Sure.
about how people are misusing it. I mean, the idea is not that if you just, put more rigorous work and tell people, just be resilient and you'll be fine. I mean, it really isn't about that. It's this idea, to me, it's this idea that we are imperfect as human beings. We're going to make mistakes and we can learn from those mistakes. And so this idea of, if I don't get something right away, that I just don't stop because I think I'm stupid. That I think, okay, well, I didn't get it the first time, so now I need to go get help, or now I need to try these strategies instead. And I know I can do it if I just spend more time, and I can get there. But I do have strategies to help me along the way. And instead of, praising somebody by saying, wow, you're super smart, praising people like, wow, I really appreciate how hard you're working and you're sticking with that problem. I mean, people pay attention to what you praise them for. And, getting the idea of a culture of people who know that they can get there if they just put the energy and time and with the help that they need, they will get there eventually. And I think that to me is really what growth mindset is about. This idea that we all should be continuously improving because we'll all be making mistakes and different things are different hardness levels for us, right? More difficult than others. And so, we can hang in there. And I do think that that's also tied to the idea of sort of our comfort, risk, and danger zones, that we know real learning happens in that risk zone where we're taking a chance because we've never really done it before, and we may fail. I mean, that's why it's risky. But if we succeed and we're in that risk zone, that's the feeling of, I nailed it, I got it. And if you don't ever do that, you're never going to have that feeling if you live in the comfort zone.
Yeah, it's a really... that continuous growth is the piece that I think is the real focus. It's the mindset as it's juxtaposed to whether it's a teacher or an insurance adjuster or whoever it is, that as a person you would become stagnant and not look to continuously grow in some way, shape, or form, that you're just comfortable with the status quo.
Right.
And of course, as a teacher, we want that constant trajectory of growth and learning to be evident in their practice, but that's the mindset. And so how do we get students to understand that they are where they are? They may not be where they want to be. They may actually be where they want to be, but they're not where they want to be, will want to be in a year or 2 years or 10 years or whatever the case may be. And the joy of the struggle, the process as it's going along. I have mountain biked for many years, and as you were talking, it really started resonating in some of the language that you used. I have 2 daughters, 9 and 11, and recently I've got them into mountain biking with me, and that their strength and their ability to navigate on a trail that is ups and downs and rocks and roots. It's a challenge, and there are some breakdowns, and finding that edge of that productive struggle where now my 9-year-old did some shutting down because it was harder for her than it was for my 11-year-old, just physically, and her relationship to the bike and her size and strength. But as I've done some trails with my 11-year-old only that were more suited towards her ability, but still a challenge, for her to do some things. And as I was telling my mother, I said, it's fun for me to share that time with her, but to hear her say as she's doing it, Daddy, I did it. I mean, that's growth mindset right there.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
Yeah. So
Without a doubt.
how does that lead into what I'm not familiar with, this belonging mindset?
Yeah. So belonging mindset, the idea is that everyone, students, I think they've done a lot of research around students and belonging mindset, which is that we know that students have to feel like they belong in a school, that they belong to be there, that their voices are heard, that they're respected, that there's equity, that people care about them. And it's not just that the teachers do, it's that the other students in the classroom do as well. So, because if they feel threatened or in danger, which happens a lot of times with students who are minorities or marginalized in some way, they sit in a classroom and it feels like the danger zone to them. They are constantly scanning unconsciously. Their brain does this, whether they want to or not. But they pick up on, they want to scan for any kinds of threats or problems. I mean, we're talking about things like maybe even micro expressions that people have that sort of confirm, yes, I'm in danger, yes, I need to be careful. And because they're in their danger zone, they have no energy to put forth any academic kinds of strategies or work. They don't have the energy or the bandwidth to do that. And so for them, it's really important, that belonging mindset, because if you can take a kid out of the danger zone into more of that sort of risky, comforty place, that then they do have the energy and the bandwidth to be able to apply it to their studies and to learning. So without the belonging mindset, that I feel like I belong here, that people do respect me, maybe not everybody, but enough, right? The critical mass of people. And I feel comfortable here, and I can do it. We know that people who have belonging mindset feel respected. They feel like valued. They're happier. And they're more engaged in the group's activities, whatever the group may be, in which case for students is school. And for teachers, it's maybe the faculty. But it's really hard for certain kids or teachers or any human beings in any group to all feel that way. So the importance is we need to figure out as schools, as any institutions, businesses, a lot of innovative businesses do that. They actually create systems to help people feel like they belong, right? They increase trust. They get people to feel safe, get them to feel welcomed, and that their voice is being heard, even if they feel quote unquote different somehow or other, right? Mm-hmm. So the onus should be on the group, not on the individual who's trying to belong, especially when we think about our students coming into schools and classrooms, because sometimes home is not a safe place to be, and school might be the only safe island. But how horrible if school doesn't feel safe either.
Right. Yeah, that's, as again, referring back to my daughters, one of my oldest is just entered middle school, which of course is prime time for belongingness and
yep, absolutely
feeling the opposite, and how she navigates that just as a person. So I'm wondering, is there any reasonable connection that you feel that's worth mentioning here to internal locus of control and intrinsic motivation? Because it feels like there is.
Yeah, I think there definitely is. I think some people are really good at that kind of intelligence about assessing the situation, picking up cues from people, understanding how they should talk or act or behave to be accepted by the group, or where they might fit in, what kind of skill levels they have that they can offer the group in any way. So I think that some people are really good at that and some people are not. And but they have great skills in other ways too. So I think that, if we're smart as an institution or a business, we realize that, a lot of research has shown that groups with varied membership, with different skill sets and backgrounds and thoughts and ways of thinking, those groups actually surpass groups that are made of very homogenous kinds of thinking and ways of doing, even if they're populated by what they might think of as the best and the brightest fields, because differences bring innovation and creativity. So again, I think that certain people are really great at doing that and also persevere, right? Maybe they didn't accept me now, but maybe they will a month from now. But, some people don't have that, and they really there needs to be systems that can help them, come in.
Is there any balance that feels appropriate or more helpful? For example, one of my previous podcasts just recently recorded, not published actually, but at this point, but will be by the time our talk is published, is with Bradley Campbell talking about the victimhood culture. And so moving from honor culture to, I'm drawing a blank on his other one, but the victimhood culture. So we have a responsibility as a group for that belonging and to not be intentionally hurtful to other people, and to create learning environments and environments in which people feel comfortable and safe. But there's also a responsibility on individuals to not look for and seek maybe unintentional or not even real slings and arrows kinds of things. So how does that landscape look in that belongingness mindset?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so let me come back to critical friends groups for just a minute, because I think that, I think the reason why people love the training, and we often get, this was like the best training I ever had. It's not that the protocols are like the best things they've ever seen. They're great. I mean, they're helpful. But the real reason is they sat there with 5 days and they really talk deeply with each other about things they care about. But here's the thing with critical friends groups. The idea is that everyone there will participate. That's the agreement that you come in with. So at some point in time, you're responsible for bringing your work to the table. And otherwise, you're responsible to help people out as much as you can and to help give them feedback. You can't just sit in the corner and decide not to participate. We also make sure that we have agreements where we sort of ground rules for how we're going to behave with each other. And, there's one that's used quite often, and that one is assume good intent. Right. That if we can build the safety and trust, if somebody says something that just hits me the wrong way, it's really my responsibility to say, wow, when you said this is how it made me feel. Is that really what you meant? Right? But to assume in the beginning that they didn't mean that. Right? And so then you can have that conversation. So I think that when we talk about deliberately building these spaces, we do have to keep that piece in mind. What's my responsibility as a working member of this group to everybody else, right? And that's important.
It really is, and that presuming positive intent is as our society seems to be fracturing, seems to be less and less. But Michelle, as we wrap up here, I'm curious. I want to come back to one of the things you said earlier before I give you an opportunity to share links and all that kind of thing. You said the tuning protocol is one of the top 3 protocols. I'm just curious what the other 2 are.
The other 2. So I would say the other one of the other ones is the Chalk Talk protocol. And that's a protocol that can be used. I think it's widely useful because it doesn't take a whole hour. It can be like a 20-minute thing. You can use it with, I've used it with my first graders. I've used it with people all the way through higher ed. I've used it with businesses. It's a particular kind of protocol that you can use for many different purposes. You can use it for checking on knowledge. You can use it for brainstorming. You can use it for planning. It's one where it's kind of like a graffiti wall where you have a question and just people answer the question. It's obviously an open-ended question, so it has several different answers. And then people can comment on other people's writing, and they can ask questions, and they can make connections, and they can draw pictures. But they're all doing it silently. So it's anonymous, but it's also silent. And so people really love that one. It's extremely useful.
Okay.
The third one is called the Dilemma Consultancy Protocol that we use. Yeah. And that one is a protocol where if you have some kind of professional problem, it's not like a thing that you've made, but it's a struggle or challenge with that you have in your profession at school. You can bring that to the table, and then not only can people give you the help, some suggestions about what you might do, the real purpose of that protocol is to sort of get it out there, hear what other people think about that protocol. And then the really magical piece is where they ask what we call probing questions. Mm-hmm. And the questions are not there for them to answer, because if it's a real probing question, they won't have an answer. But it's there to push their thinking outside of their box. Like, you can have a very narrow perspective when you have a dilemma, but the probing questions are meant to like take those blinders away, so you can see that all the assumptions that you might be making aren't there. And there might be a whole lot of other things that you can do or other possibilities. So it really, when people go through that experience, it just has a very profound impact. Just a group of people really trying to help them and empathize with them with this problem that they're struggling with.
Yeah, I'm familiar with both of those, and they are very good. The questions part, the probing questions are... inquiry is at the heart of almost everything that we do, and I just really truly believe that I'm almost to the point of thinking about our professional development and how we might help teachers really engage in improving their craft, not just through workshops on specific pedagogy things, but just engaging them in just inquiry experiences where they're really diving into inquiry, maybe even around topics that are not of education, related, just whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Just because it feels like when, just like the protocols, when they have an opportunity to have rich professional dialogue, when they get an opportunity to engage in rich inquiry, it's like a light bulb that goes off and an engine that you can't shut down. And teachers can be sort of trained, if you will, but once, just like any learner, students or whatever the case may be, it's like, boy, once that engine is started, you just get out of the way, and they're just going to grow and really turn their practice into a better and better experience for the learners. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, when I do leadership training with businesses, a big section of that is asking questions.
Right.
And it's one of the ones that people comment on the most, because they find it so useful. Oh, I never really thought about different kinds of questions for different kinds of experiences, right? This idea of how to ask questions, it's a big one. So I agree with you 100% on that one.
Yeah, well, I want to give you an opportunity, as I mentioned, to mention, I know that the website is nsrfharmony.org, and we'll put that in the show notes and all that stuff. There's a ton of protocols there. Some of them, almost all of them, are free, right? There's some that are
well, we
not.
have the older protocols, the original ones are free, but we have updated a lot of the protocols, and those are the ones that we use for trainings that we feel like, people need to be trained.
Sure.
So if you come to our training, then you get a whole nother level of protocols and activities. But if you don't want to get trained, but you still want to get more updated versions of the originals, it's like $25 for a year membership to get into those. So you can just decide at what level you want to go in. Right. But we do have a lot of free stuff. So.
Okay. Any other places they should find you, social media or anything like that?
Yeah. So we have our Twitter is at the NSRF. Facebook, National School Reform Faculty, and Instagram, NSRF Harmony.
Look at you guys. You're living in the 21st century.
Well, we could be doing a lot more with all of those things, but we're trying.
It's hard to keep up sometimes, for sure.
It is.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, I always appreciate the work that you all do and the resources. And like I said, we use the tuning protocol extensively and have engaged educators in some of the other pieces. So it's a pleasure to talk with you. And I'm actually surprised that that we haven't had a chance that I haven't thought to reach out and do this before, because I think it's a real value to educators around the world. So thank you so much for the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated this talk we had. So thanks.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.